What if a king wrote letters across the ocean, begging for the end of a trade he himself had helped to build? What if that king was real, his words survived to this day, and the world simply decided not to tell you his name? What if the story you were never taught was the one that changed everything? This is that story, long before European sails appeared on that horizon. A kingdom stood on the western edge of Central Africa. Organized, governed, alive, the Kingdom of Congo was not a territory waiting to be discovered. It was a world that had been building itself for over a century, with its own laws, its own court, its own vision of power. At its center stood Manza Congo, a capital city not of stone but of hardwood, compacted earth, and carefully organized intention. Thousands of people, a royal quarter, organized streets, districts for nobles, traders, craftsmen, and administrators. Not a scattered collection of villages, not a territory without history, a city that knew exactly what it was, built from the land it stood on. The king, the Mani Congo, ruled through appointed governors, each province tied to the capital by obligation, ritual, and loyalty. Trade routes connected the interior to the coast. Copper, ivory, raffia cloth, and Nzimbu shells used as currency, moving through networks built across generations, a living economy, a functioning state, long before any foreign ship appeared on that western horizon. The Congo people had names for the forces that shaped the world, ceremonies marking birth, death, power, a visual language embedded in woven cloth and carved copper, geometric patterns carrying meaning that outsiders would spend centuries failing to read. They were not waiting for someone to arrive and give them civilization. They already had one. In 1483, Portuguese caravels reached the mouth of the Congo River. The encounter that followed was not an invasion. Not yet. Two organized powers looked at each other and recognized something familiar. Envoys were exchanged. Symbols of rank presented. Cautious words moved between two worlds that had never before shared the same horizon. 8 years later, the Mani Congo accepted baptism. He took the name Joao. The first Christianity entered the royal court, not as conquest, not as submission, but as calculation. A king who recognized that this new faith was also a bridge to trade, to alliance, to a powerful partner on the other side of the ocean. A door, he chose to open it. Joao I had a son. His name was Memba Nzinga. Baptized young, educated by missionaries, convinced, genuinely convinced, that Christianity and Congo could build something together the world had never seen. History would know him as Afonso I. He would become one of the most consequential rulers Central Africa ever produced, and one of its most tragic. But the throne was not given to him. It had to be taken. His half-brother Mpansu Akadema stood against him, backed by those who saw Christian consolidation as a threat to everything Congo had been. In 1506, the two forces met in battle. What followed would determine not just who ruled Congo, but what Congo would become. Afonso I. Later accounts would call it a miracle. History calls it what it was, a military victory, built on strategy, alliance, and force. He took the throne of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Central Africa. He had a vision for his people. What he could not yet see was what was already moving across the ocean quietly toward him. After the battle, Afonso moved quickly. Churches were built. Clerical education expanded. Correspondence with Portugal intensified, but he did not dismantle what Congo already was. Provincial administration remained. Customary practices continued. He was not replacing his kingdom. He was adding a new layer to it. Christianity as a tool of power, not a surrender of identity. With alliance came commerce. Royal envoys crossed the ocean. European goods circulated among elites. Metal tools, textiles, religious objects, and captives. At first, the transfer of enslaved people operated within defined agreements. Prisoners of war, those already bound by existing systems. It seemed manageable, integrated into diplomacy, rather than threatening to it. Slavery itself was not new, not to Congo, not to Europe, not to the world of the 15th century. Forms of captivity existed across Africa, Asia, and Europe, linked to warfare, debt, and systems of obligation that had existed for centuries. What was coming would differ, not in existence, but in scale, in distance, in the coldness of pure economics. As Portuguese settlements expanded across the Atlantic, demand for labor grew. Sugar plantations in the islands, then Brazil. Coastal exchanges extended inland. Intermediary networks formed, connecting provincial leaders to oceanic markets. They had never imagined the movement of captives grew in volume, in regularity quietly exceeding every diplomatic expectation. And here is the part the simple version of this story often leaves out. Certain Congo elites engaged directly in this commerce, leveraging captives and imported goods to strengthen their own political standing. Wealth accumulation was happening outside the exclusive channels of the crown. The system was not only something done to Congo, parts of Congo, where inside it, those enriched by trade accumulated followers, secured alliances, expanded local influence. Authority that once flowed exclusively from Banza Congo now competed with economic power, distributed unevenly across provinces. The monarchy's symbolic weight remained, but governance was shifting from command to negotiation, a slow fracture, almost invisible, until it wasn't. By the early 1520s, Afonso saw it clearly. Portuguese traders operating beyond coastal settlements, bypassing formal authorization, blurring the line between lawful exchange and opportunistic capture, free subjects disappearing, people connected to noble households, people who should have been untouchable. The kingdom was being eaten from the edges, and the center was struggling to hold. Afonso faced something no military victory could solve. Continued engagement with Atlantic trade brought diplomatic prestige and material resources, but unchecked expansion was tearing the social fabric of everything he had built. This was not a rebellion he could suppress, not an enemy he could face in battle. It was a system, and systems do not negotiate. Portuguese merchants were motivated by profit. Their interests did not align with royal directives issued from Banza, Congo. Distance, maritime logistics, competing authorities in Lisbon, all complicated regulation. Even when diplomatic intentions were acknowledged, practical compliance remained uneven. The alliance that had seemed so full of promise in 1491 was beginning to show what it actually was. And so in 1526, Afonso I did something extraordinary. He picked up a quill and he wrote a letter to the King of Portugal, documenting in his own words what was being done to his people. A sovereign king riding across the ocean, asking to be heard. Those letters survived. What they contain will tell you everything history forgot to say. In his letters, Afonso wrote with the precision of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. He was not writing in desperation. He was writing in fury. Controlled, documented, royal. Merchants were taking, not criminals, not prisoners of war, but free subjects, people connected to noble households, people under the direct protection of the crown. He described a kingdom unsettled by practices that ignored every agreement ever signed between Congo and Portugal. Men seized on roads, families separated without authorization, the social hierarchy that held his kingdom together being dismantled, transaction by transaction, not in war, not through conquest, through commerce, quietly, systematically, without a single battle being fought. His demand was not isolation. He was not asking Portugal to end the relationship. He asked for licensed agents only, supervised transactions, respect for the boundaries. That had been agreed. He asked for the alliance to mean something. What he received in return was the most devastating answer a king can receive. Not refusal, silence, delay, and more ships. The problem was not that Portugal refused to listen. The problem was deeper than that. The Atlantic economy did not answer to any single king, not to the King of Portugal, certainly not to the King of Congo. It answered to demand, to profit, to the arithmetic of plantation labor, multiplying across the ocean, faster than any treaty could possibly contain. And within Congo itself, not everyone wanted it to stop. Provincial leaders, whose power had grown through participation in trade, were not eager to close the door. Some had built small empires of influence and wealth on the same commerce. Their king was trying to regulate. The fracture was no longer just between Congo and Portugal. It was inside the kingdom, inside the court. Afonso's institutions endured. Courts still functioned. Diplomacy continued. The monarchy retained its legitimacy. But the kingdom operating in the 1530s was not the kingdom that had greeted Portuguese envoys in 1483. The balance had shifted. Governance had become a permanent negotiation between a king trying to hold the center and forces that no longer needed the center to survive. Younger elites had grown up inside this system. For them, Atlantic commerce was not a disruption, it was normal. The world Afonso had inherited, where the Congo stood, at the absolute center of every network of power and trade. That world was becoming a memory, not through invasion, not through defeat in battle, through the slow erosion of everything that had made it whole. He kept writing, letter after letter, year after year, to the King of Portugal, to the Pope, documenting abuses, naming names, requesting intervention, a king who refused to accept that the world had already moved past him, or perhaps a king who understood exactly what was happening and chose to leave behind a record so that someone someday would know. Afonso I died in 1543. He left behind a Christian kingdom recognized across Europe. He left behind stone churches, diplomatic correspondence, and a generation of Congolese. Educated in European letters, he also left behind unresolved tensions between provincial autonomy and central control, between regulated exchange and expanding demand. Those tensions did not die with him. This was not the story of a king who failed. It was the story of a ruler navigating transformation at the edge of a world, expanding faster than any single court could contain. He governed, he negotiated, he documented, he fought not with armies, but with language, law, and the stubborn insistence that his kingdom deserved to be treated as what it was, a sovereign state. After Afonso died, the Atlantic system did not pause to mourn him. Maritime routes intensified. Colonial plantations multiplied. Demand for labor did not recede. The structural forces that had challenged his authority during his lifetime remained fully active, now without the one voice that had spent decades insisting they could be contained. The ships kept coming. Congo persisted as a kingdom, as a political entity, as a name on European maps and in diplomatic correspondence. But the kingdom of the 1550s was operating inside a commercial world whose scale had made Afonso's dream of regulation a historical footnote the center had held. But what this center was holding together had already been quietly, irreversibly changed. But the letters survived, preserved in European archives. Lisbon, Rome, Madrid, the handwritten words of an African king addressing the most powerful courts of the 16th century. They do not read like the words of a defeated man. They read like the words of someone who understood that if the present could not be changed, then at least the record of it should not be erased. History often foregrounds the ships, the routes, the empires expanding across the ocean. It records the scale of trade and the movement of goods. Less frequently does it pause to consider the letters written by those on the other side of that equation, the negotiations, the petitions, the regulatory efforts of African rulers who were not passive, not silent, and not without voice. And the full truth is more complex still. Congo was not only a victim of the Atlantic system, its leaders participated in it. Some enriched themselves through it. The same mechanisms of captivity that had existed within the kingdom became the infrastructure through which millions would eventually be moved across the ocean. Complexity does not erase suffering, but it demands honesty. To frame this history solely as victimhood would be to erase what Afonso actually was: a ruler, a strategist, a man who wrote letters when others would have surrendered to silence. To describe it only as collaboration would ignore every documented attempt to regulate, resist, and defend the integrity of what he had built. The record holds both. History must hold both. Afonso I stands at the threshold of the modern world. He governed during the decades when Atlantic exchange shifted from diplomatic novelty to structural reality. His efforts to supervise commerce and defend hierarchy mark one of the earliest documented attempts by an African monarch to manage integration into an emerging global economy on his own terms. In his own words, the expansion of Atlantic trade would continue long after his death, reshaping Central Africa in ways neither he nor his contemporaries could fully predict. Yet the letters remain, not as relics of failure, as testimony that political authority in Congo was articulated, argued, and defended. They document intention, not silence, in the face of everything that was coming. The Kingdom of Congo did not kneel before transformation. Without response, it negotiated treaties, restructured its administration, sent ambassadors to Rome, wrote letters that crossed oceans. Its leaders confronted forces larger than any single court, and they did so through language, through law, through the refusal to accept that their world could be unmade. Without leaving a record of what it had been, empires expanded, ships multiplied, commerce consumed everything in its reach. But alongside those movements survives the written record of a king who refused to surrender his voice. In those preserved letters, we find what history so rarely offers: proof that someone on the other side of power was paying attention and refused to be silent. This is tales they never told. Tell us whose story we should tell next.